I'm recording this homily for the 12th Sunday of Ordinary Time. And we've made it through all of the different festivities from Easter through the Feast Day of the Trinity, Corpus Christi, and now we're back into Ordinary Time. The Gospel reading, I think, is beautiful this weekend. The Gospel reading, the very first part of it, Jesus is saying something that I think we find very consoling. He's saying, fear no one, right? So he's speaking to the 12, and he says, fear no one. Especially, do not fear the ones in your lives who can harm the body, but can do nothing to the soul. In other words, don't expend the energy in fearing the people in your life and in my life who can cause us problems, who can make life miserable. But don't fear them. And so whether it's your boss, whether it's your spouse, and I'm not saying that, against your spouse, I'm just saying, sometimes, in marriages we have difficulties, right? Maybe it's one of your kids, whoever it is. If there's somebody who's doing something and it's causing anxiety in your life, it's causing fear, Jesus comes out and says, and he's saying this to the 12, who are going to be the leaders of the church, he's saying, don't fear the people who are going to threaten you, who are not going to like what you're doing, who are going to make life difficult. Don't fear them. Okay. I think we like that. I like that, right? But then it continues on. And here's where it gets interesting. He says, do not fear those who can kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna. All right, Gehenna is actually a geographical place. It is a valley just south? Maybe I've been saying it wrong all weekend. Is it north? Well, I'll just say it's south. Anyways, it's a valley just south of the old city in Jerusalem. And the valley of Gehenna is a valley where people would come and dump their garbage, their trash, and it would burn. It would just perpetually burn. It was just a big burning garbage dump, right? And so the valley of Gehenna was a very unpleasant place. Nobody resided there. And so Jesus is using it as an example to illustrate hell. And he'll use it many times. It's eternal. It's not pleasant, right? It is hell. And so he's saying, don't be afraid of the one who can harm the body but can do nothing more. If you're going to be afraid, right? So he's saying, all right, if you're going to have fear, then you better fear the right person, the right one, right? Who's the right one? And so he says, the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Now, for so many years, when I would read that, I didn't think about it really deeply, and so I just assumed that because it was talking about hell, that it must be talking about Satan. And we often fear Satan, right? We don't like Satan. He's bad. He's often trying to make our lives miserable. And so to fear him seemed to make sense. But it's not Satan, is it? Satan has no power. Satan only has power when we give him power. Satan only has power when we're afraid. Because when we're afraid, we betray love. And when we betray love, we betray God who is love. And so Satan loves us to be afraid. He loves us to be isolated. He loves to separate us from others. Because when we're separated, when we're all alone, we are far more timid. We are far more afraid. We're far less courageous. And so Satan wants to create a whole culture of isolation. But it's not Satan. Satan doesn't have the power to destroy both soul and body. Who does? God does. And when the light bulb for me, the first time it went on when I read this gospel, that he's saying, if you're going to fear anybody, fear God. It was like, that makes sense. But it's also terrifying. Because I don't want to fear God. And if I think that that's all our faith is cracked up to be, that's all our faith is to fear God and to live in fear of God, that's not very attractive. I don't want to be an evangelist of that. So let's go deeper. I shared a story this weekend at some of the masses as part of my vocation story. And so when I was in engineering school, I was going to the UW and I was studying engineering, and I love engineering. I love inventing things. I love designing things. I love building things. I've always loved that. I've always got some project I'm working on the side. But I also knew that I could not sit at a desk the rest of my life. I just couldn't do it. Maybe I'm ADHD, I don't know, but I just couldn't sit at a desk the rest of my life. And so my heart started wandering and wondering what I should do with my life. Because I didn't want necessarily the engineering life where I sit at a desk in front of a computer 8 hours a day. I had been impacted in a couple ways by some police officers, and I really looked up to them. And I saw what they were doing in the community as truly being an expression of love, that they were truly serving the community. And it really attracted me. And so I started looking at it very seriously. And I was still in school at the time, but I started testing with police departments. So I tested with one police department, and at the time, there was a lot of people who were looking at becoming police officers. There were 300 applicants for, I think, like 7 or 8 positions. And so the first test was a written test, and I did really good. I passed the first hurdle, and so I did fine. The second test was a physical test. It was running and push-ups and things like that, and I barely passed. I was not in good shape at all. But I had enough energy or enough ability to pass. So I get into the oral test, and this is the oral board. This is where 7 or 8 police officers who are interviewing each candidate. And at this point, I think there were about 30 candidates left. And so I'm doing fine in the interview. And then a police officer asked me a question that completely flummoxed me. I mean, I was just baffled by it. And I felt like I had an answer. But something happened. There used to be a rule in canon law, so the law of the church. It's not in effect anymore, but there used to be. And somewhere I had heard the rule that if a person ever killed someone, they could never become a priest. Okay? It's not a rule anymore, but it was somewhere in my subconscious. So you have to understand that when I'm looking at becoming a police officer, I have no desire to be a priest. I have no inclination to be a priest. In fact, I never did. When I was a kid and priests would come up and say, "Have you ever thought about being a priest?" My answer was very clear. It was no. I want to be married and I want to have 10 kids. That was all I knew. But that's what I wanted. That's what I wanted. And you also have to understand that up to this point, I had never asked God what He wanted. Talk about a terrifying question. I'd never asked God. And so the police officer asks me a question, and he says, if you ever had to, in the line of duty, could you kill someone? Obviously, for justifiable reasons, right? You're stopping somebody, and could you ever shoot and kill someone if you had to in the line of duty? And for whatever reason, immediately what popped in my mind was, but then I could never be a priest. I have no idea where that came from. It was not part of my life at all. And so when the police officer asked me the question, I was like absolutely speechless. I couldn't say anything. I didn't know how to respond because that thought was just like this wall in my mind. It's like, but then I couldn't be a priest if I ever had to do that. Well, we could call that a Holy Spirit moment, but it was a moment when I think I legitimately feared God because God spoke in that moment. I left that meeting just dripping in sweat. I mean, I was just completely blown away. I had no idea what had happened. God was at work. And I think there was a moment of true fear because God was being so powerful in that moment. He was being a good father. That's what he was being. Now let's keep going, right? Because Jesus, when he said, if you're going to fear anybody, fear the only one who can destroy both body and soul in hell, he was speaking of God, because God's the only one. But he doesn't necessarily want us to fear God. He's just saying, if you got to fear somebody, fear the right one. Well, in that moment, when I was in that meeting with the police officers, God gave me an opportunity to know fear. And it was the fear of not doing his will. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. Now, what Jesus doesn't want, he doesn't want us going out and telling everybody, fear God. Like, God's watching, you better watch out, you're going to go to hell. He doesn't want that. That's abusive. That's an abusive father, if that's all there is. Now, mom and dad, sometimes you have to put the fear of God in your kids. I understand that. But that's not the standard protocol. That's not where love in its fullness resides. So he keeps going on. And this is where it becomes profound. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a small coin? Yet not one of them falls to the ground without your Father's knowledge. He notices. He notices something so small, something so insignificant, things that we can completely take for granted in our lives, the things that we don't notice anymore, our Heavenly Father notices. And it's not, he's watching, it's not that kind of notice. He notices as a father. Mom and dad, when mom and dad notice things, they're being a good mom and dad. They notice something about their kid. They notice, you notice as a mom and dad, you notice when something's not quite right with your child, when their behavior has changed or something's going on. You notice those things. But if we don't notice, then it means there's something wrong with us, not with our child. And so God notices. Even all the hairs of your head are counted. He notices. For some of us, it's getting easier to count. But he notices. And then he says, this is the heart of it, right? So do not be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. You are worth more than many sparrows. God notices us. He notices the good things happening in our life. He notices the bad things. He wants us to talk to him about it. He wants us to come into the church and spend time in quiet and silence. And not talk to a video camera, but to talk to Jesus. He wants that. Because he notices. He desires. I wonder if we're afraid as a culture of silence. Not of silence, but of sitting with God who notices us. It's easier to pretend he doesn't notice. It's easier to pretend that God is distant or abstract. But he notices. There's something beautiful about Jesus. I shared this in a homily at a wedding. There's two things that Jesus did when he was here that I think are just profound, they're beautiful, and they're important to always keep in mind. And one is that, right? It's what he did on the cross. He wasn't afraid. And so when Jesus says, don't be afraid, he means it. Because he wasn't afraid. He wasn't afraid to come into the messiness of our lives. It's very tempting that we want to put our leaders, our most cherished people, on pedestals. We want to separate them from ourselves. We want to honor them and revere them and make life easier for them and give them gifts and adorn them and all those things. And they wanted to do that with Jesus, and Jesus refused. He immersed himself in the messiness of our lives, and he noticed. He noticed when somebody was a sinner. He noticed when they need healing. He noticed when somebody was ill. He noticed when somebody was abandoned. He noticed isolation, and he came to conquer it. And even when we took that isolation upon him and killed him for it, he still noticed, and he refused to be afraid. He stood his ground in love for all of his creation. And so that's one thing that we always need to keep in mind. Jesus Christ did not fear. But there's something also that we also need to remember. And it's something he did before he died on the cross. He built a family. Right? What's the very first line in the gospel? Got to find the right gospel. The very first line in the gospel. Jesus said to the 12. Jesus said to the 12. And so what he did was he went around gathering people, forming a unit, a family, a church, an assembly, right? And so there were men, there were women, there were people who were from all different walks of life, and he gathered them into one, and he created strength and unity. And then from that strength, as he taught them, as he guided them, as he consoled them, as he encouraged them, as he challenged them, from that strength, they could then do what he did, and that was to engage the rest of the world and to bring it forth. And so when he says, do not be afraid, what he's saying is, let's form a family unit in your parish. If you are not actively engaged in things happening in the life of the community, if you are not helping the gospel to thrive, then it's not going to thrive. I say that to myself as well. If I'm not doing it, then it's not going to thrive. And so that first step is Jesus gathered them together and strengthened them to be a unit, to be a family. And anything that was going to separate them, he would want to root out. Because we're always going to have things. We have different personalities. We have sin. We struggle. We hurt each other. And so he gave us a path to always keep building reconciliation and healing there. And so that's the first thing. We must build a strong family unit, parish family, community, wider community. And then we're not going to fear to bring it into the world. And so we can then plant that cross anywhere it needs to be. And so you encounter somebody who's an atheist, plant the cross right there. Not in a judgmental way or obnoxious way, but you let Jesus just reside. You let him be there. Even if it's in silence, you let him be there. No fear. I believe there's a company that took that as their motto. Well, they stole that from Jesus. Going to sue him. So, be not afraid, right? There's an example I use sometimes at my wedding masses. It's really dumb, but I like it. And it's when I was a kid, we would watch professional wrestling, right? And it was so fake. It's like a man's version of a soap opera. It was all fake. It was all drama. But as a kid, we would get so into it. And I always loved tag team wrestling. Because in tag team wrestling, there was always this hope that even when somebody was getting all beat up, that person, that wrestler, could reach over and tag his partner. And if they can just touch, that's all they need to do is just touch each other, then his partner could come in and rescue him. And there was all this drama of one wrestler getting beat up and he was reaching and reaching, but they just couldn't quite touch, right? It's almost like that famous painting of God the Father reaching out to God the Son and their fingers are just touching, right? Professional wrestling. So they're just reaching out to touch. And so the idea is, now I do this at weddings, not because marriage is a wrestling match, But because it's like a tag team, you're a team. And so when one's getting beat up, you have the other there waiting in the wings to help, to protect, to strengthen, and vice versa. And so Jesus understands that. We need that. That's why he sent his disciples out 2 by 2. He never sent them out alone. When Jesus was on the cross, was he alone? He was not alone. I mean, it's one of the most beautiful conversion stories was of the good thief, the thief that was next to him. He was not alone. Even on the cross, Mary was there. Mary Magdalene was there. John was there. There was never a time in Jesus' life when he was alone. That didn't mean it was going to be easy, but he was never alone. That's why family is so important. My last little story, my last little anecdote. Last week we were at Priest Days, which was a gathering of all the priests for the Archdiocese of Seattle, and normally every day we would have Mass, and each of the first 3 days one of our bishops would give the homily, but on the last day we have this tradition that one of the newly ordained priests gives the homily at Mass, and one of the baby priests. And so we had 4 new priests, so they had to choose one of them. Well, they chose Father Jeff Moore, who's going to be here in the Skagit Valley starting next week with Father Tom McMichaels and Father Armando Red. And so Father Jeff Moore, who's only been a priest for like 3 weeks, gets up and gives a homily to bishops and priests. And I have to say, he did a phenomenal job. His homily was so good, I wanted to start clapping. I mean, I loved it. I had a big smile on my face, and that doesn't happen very often. I had a big smile on my face, and I thoroughly enjoyed it because I felt 2 things. I felt like there was love there, but there was power behind it. There was no fear in what he was saying. Now, one of the things that he said, I'm not going to go through it all, but one of the things that he said was, he said that his generation is the millennials, right? And he says the millennials are angry, and they're becoming increasingly angry. And they're angry because they're looking for what we all look for, happiness, peace, joy, and they're not finding it. And they're even becoming more frustrated because the source of it, to them, is something that they're afraid of. And I can go into it a lot more, but I think the essential message that Father Jeff was sharing with us, to us as priests, was, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to plant that cross right in the middle of a culture that is afraid, that's afraid of Jesus, and that can be even very hostile to Jesus. But don't be afraid, because they are looking. And maybe if we can allow the crucifixion to happen here in our midst, if we can allow ourselves to be crucified, then we can bring the resurrection. We can bring salvation, redemption, reconciliation. I thought it was beautiful. It was so powerful. So don't be afraid. All right, next week, I'm in my new assignment. I'm at St. Mary's in Marysville, Washington, and St. Anne's in Tulalip. And so I'll start recording my homilies in a new location. All right, God bless.